Hey guys, welcome back to Wallowa Hikes. I'm Chris, and if you're a new backpacker or you're just getting all of your gear together for the first time, you've probably done a lot of research on the big three: your backpack, your tent, sleep system. One thing that gets overlooked a lot is what you're going to cook in. So if you're watching this, it's likely you've been watching other channels to get an idea and compare different gear. But one thing that gets overlooked a lot is that cook pot. And most likely you've probably seen the Toaks titanium 750 milliliter pot everywhere, and you might be tempted to go get that. And here it is. And this is a really good piece of gear, but it might not be right for you. So the Toaks pots come in different sizes, and most people seem to have the 750 milliliter pot. And there's a reason for that. You can nest your fuel canister and most likely your stove in here along with a mini Byke lighter, and it fits pretty good. And so it makes sense that it's pretty popular. And it's pretty convenient, except at just over 3 cups of capacity, 750 milliliters, means you're going to be kind of pushing the capacity if you tend to make meals and drinks. So in the morning, I know one of my favorite breakfast meals that's freeze-dried takes 2 cups of water, and then I drank 12 to 16 ounces of coffee, which means I end up boiling twice if I'm using this pot. And for some people that's not a big deal. Personally, I find it a little irritating to have to boil twice. It's inconvenient, and even though I'm not necessarily going anywhere out there, I'd rather just boil once and get right to my breakfast and coffee. So, if that's an issue for you, that's something to think about. The right pot for you really depends on your personal needs. So think about what that's going to look like for you when you're out on the trail and in camp. So let's take a look at different features. Now, most pots are made out of aluminum or titanium. There's also stainless steel pots. But for the most part, you're going to run across titanium or aluminum, and each has its pros and cons. Now, titanium is super light, very durable, so you can knock it around pretty good, but it's not a good conductor of heat. So if you're doing actual cooking, you're more likely to burn your food using titanium because you get hot spots. Aluminum, on the other hand, conducts heat evenly. So if you're doing actual cooking, an aluminum pot is probably a better choice for you. Having said that, aluminum does weigh a little bit more and it dents easier. Now, another big difference is titanium cools off a lot faster. Now, that can be a good thing if you're ready to pack up your stuff right away. But if you're cooking in the pot or eating out of the pot, your food can cool down a lot quicker, and that can be a problem out there. Aluminum pots, they hold the heat longer. That means you're going to have to wait a little longer if you're trying to pack up quickly. But if you're cooking in that pot and eating right out of it, your food's going to stay hot a bit longer than using titanium. So let's look at 3 options that I have. What we have here is a Toaks 750 milliliter titanium pot, which is super popular. Next to it is a similar pot from Evolved Equipment Company. It's also titanium, but it has different features. And finally, the classic Stanley Adventure Cook Set, sturdy, affordable aluminum. This is what I was using for years. So you'll notice each one has different handles and lids, and that's something to think about as well. All of these work fine, but there's pros and cons to each. So for instance, with the titanium Toaks cookpot, there is this tiny little wire handle on the top, really close to the lid, really tiny, and I have burned myself on that many times. So if you're using something like that, you're going to want to have some kind of a pot holder, a buff, even a shirt sleeve, whatever. But you'll notice with the Evolved pot, that has a wooden handle on the top of the lid, and that makes all the difference for me out there. So I actually prefer that because I don't have to mess around with making sure I don't burn my fingers on that. Now the handles on the sides, if you don't make sure those are out when you start cooking, they're going to get super hot on both of those. So that also is an issue. And notice that the Stanley pot, which is cheap and aluminum, has a handle that folds out, keeps it away from the base. And so usually you can just grab that with your bare hands even after cooking. And it makes it a little easier to pour out the water if that's what you're doing, is boiling water for a freeze-dried meal. And that's something I figured out in the woods while I was backpacking. I bought the Tokes pot because everybody else had it, and I ended up burning myself and having to remember that it has that tiny little wire handle on the lid. So this is a feature you might want to think about before you buy your pot. And here in a few minutes, I'm going to show you another option, which is a Jetboil all-in-one system. And I bring it up because they're insulated and the handles are not metal, and you never have to worry about if you're going to burn yourself with these when you're using them to drink or to pour water out. And the same goes for the Pika lid. I don't know, Pika, depends on what country you're from, I suppose. This is a third-party lid that takes the whole burn aspect out of everything, because you don't even have to touch the pot when you're pouring your water out. We'll take a look at that as well. All right, so let's talk about pot size. I've already mentioned that the 750 milliliter, even though it's super popular, might not be right for everybody. I'm personally thinking of going back to a bigger pot, just so it's more convenient for me. So that's something to think about. But also, another aspect of pot size is going to be your cook time, because a smaller pot is going to boil water faster. It's just less to do, less surface area to heat up. So if you don't want to wait around too long, you might want a smaller pot. But if you're in a group and you're boiling water for lots of people, something bigger might be better over time. So smaller pot, faster boiling, bigger pot, faster over time if you're doing big batches. Now, another thing I noticed when I switched to the narrower Tokes titanium pot is that the center of gravity is also different. If it's a taller, narrower pot, it's going to be less stable if you're using a traditional backpacking stove, so more likely to tip over. Now, if you're just doing this on a picnic table, no big deal. But if you're on uneven ground or in high winds, a wider base is going to be more stable for you, especially if you have a smaller backpacking stove. And going back to cooking real food, it's going to be a lot easier to stir without tipping your pot if you have a wider base. So taller, narrower pots, a little less stable. And that's another thing to think about. Now, one of the reasons people go with those 750 milliliter pots is that they nest your stove and your fuel and a Bic lighter really nicely. So when you're thinking about how you're going to pack your cookware, sometimes having something that nests is going to make it a little easier to pack everything overall, because it's really efficient as far as space goes. Some people feel like they only need like a 550 milliliter pot. And that's fine if that's all they need, except it makes it a little harder when you're packing all your stuff in the backpack overall, because you're not fitting as much in here. Now, granted, they're smaller and take up less space, but often you find yourself having wasted space because it's too small for both the stove and the fuel. And so you got some empty space in there. And unless you get creative, you're not going to be filling that space. Same thing goes for a bigger pot. You can have wasted space in there for sure. So that's another thing to think about if you're going with a smaller pack out there, because you want to be efficient with how you pack what you're bringing. So size affects everything. How you pack, how fast you boil water, and if it's going to be tippy or stable. So think about that while you're shopping for your cook pot. So earlier I mentioned that you want to buy a pot based on your needs. So one of the big things to think about is Are you just going to be boiling water, or are you going to be cooking real food out there? I mentioned stirring. Now, if you get a narrow pot and you try to cook real food in that, especially with titanium, you're going to tend to burn your food. So if you're actually going to be cooking food out there instead of just boiling water for freeze-dried meals, think about that when you buy. You're probably going to want aluminum, which distributes the heat better, and you're probably going to want something that is a little wider. And then there's pans. And pans can be heavy, and you want to have to carry that 16 miles if you're only going to be using it once. Now, if you're doing a shorter trip, just an overnight, or setting up a base camp, you might want to bring a pan. It might be worth it for you then. So think about, are you going to be frying eggs, bacon, whatever? Yeah, you're going to want a pan for that. You're not going to do that in a Toaks titanium pot. That's for sure. And I mentioned that pans are heavy and bulky, but they do make pans for backpacking, and some of them nest, and most of them have foldable handles. So that's something to think about. But if you're also boiling water, you're probably bringing more pans. And more means more weight. Keep in mind, cooking food takes longer than just boiling water. And you have a cleanup aspect to that as well. So if that's a problem for you, you might want to stick with a pot, boiling water, doing freeze-dried meals. But if you don't mind the cleanup, then you're going to probably want a pan or a pot that's going to work best for cooking that food. Now, you may also need to bring some kind of a scrubber, and always follow leave no trace. So do not wash those pans in the beautiful lake you're camping next to. Personally, I found myself burning food quite a bit when I was starting out backpacking, and I really hated the cleanup aspect of that. So that's why I've gone with just boiling water and meals in a bag. And if you've been hiking all day, it's getting dark, it's cold out, it's a lot easier to just boil water than cook a full meal. But especially in a group setting, sometimes it's really nice to have that experience of cooking. So again, think about what you're going to need depending on your style out there. And speaking of cooking real food, most of these backpacking stoves are made to boil water fast. So it can be kind of hard to simmer. And if you are using a tall pot, that means not a lot of simmer control. So you're going to want a pot that's going to make it a little easier to do that. Now, hopefully you get a backpacking stove that's fairly adjustable. So if you do want to simmer food, you're going to be able to do that. What you can't do that with, really, is a Jetboil system. Now, the Jetboil is super convenient. It's going to boil water super fast, and there's quite a bit of capacity in these, and they come in different sizes, and they come with different accessories, and they're really expensive, but they work really great if you're just boiling water. Now, if you try to cook food in these, you're going to have a harder time because there really isn't much simmer control to these at all, and it's hard to stir food in them. So if you're going to go with a Jetboil, there are definitely some pluses to that, but think about what you're going to do out there and how much capability of change you want to have over time. Getting a Jetboil is going to pretty much limit you to boiling water. Now, you can cook in these. I've done ramen in them, and I had a hell of a time not having it boil over the whole time. So think about that. But the pluses of it is they're an all-in-one system. They're fairly simple to use, and the way they're made, they already have a cozy to help keep it warm, insulate the food, and keep you from burning your hands when you take that pot. And it's got a handle on it. The lid is not metal, and you can drink right out of it without burning your lips on the sides. So definitely some pluses. They are way, way heavier than a titanium pot and a typical backpacking stove. So you want to think about that as well. So if you want to go with the Jetboil, that's great. And if that works for you, that's great. They're just not quite as versatile. Now, with a regular titanium or aluminum pot, you aren't stuck with just one system. I can take the same pot out there without my backpacking stove, not have to bring a canister. I can use an alcohol stove. I can use a cat food can and some alcohol. So definitely, if you're interested in trying different sources of heat out there for cooking, I would go with a regular traditional pot. Now, I mentioned lids earlier, and the lids these come with, like I said, depending on what you get, you might want to be careful about burning yourself. Now, the Pika lid really seems to solve that problem and a lot of other problems. I'm not going to go into it so much today because we're talking about pots, not lids. But it does bring up another thing, and that is that my Stanley pot that doesn't have a lid, it probably had a lid at some time, but that thing is close to 20 years old. But what I found myself using was just a sheet of aluminum, and that worked great. And putting the lid on, of course, helps water boil faster, and you can just remove that really easily. It weighs next to nothing. It's super easy to replace. So that's something to think about as well. So if you hate those lids with those handles that keep burning your hands, you can leave that at home and just bring some aluminum foil. It works fine. Now, one thing I didn't talk about yet was cost. Now, titanium is generally going to cost more money. Titanium golf clubs cost more money. Titanium everything costs more money. So, depending on what your budget is, that should factor into what you're going to buy. Aluminum is fine. It works fine. And it's going to cost you a lot less money. But it might weigh a little bit more. It's not nearly as durable. And so just to give you an idea of what some of these things cost, let's take a look here on screen. As you can see, there's vast price differences. And of course, there's pros and cons to whatever you get. And as I said before, think about what your needs are. Just because everybody else is using a 750 milliliter Tox titanium pot doesn't mean that's going to be the right choice for you. So think about what you're going to use it for, how you're going to cook, and what your budget is. Just because it's right for lots of other people doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right for you. I have plenty of gear that people said was wonderful that I don't use because it just doesn't fit my needs. So thanks for hanging out with me today. Hopefully, if you're a new backpacker, this will help you make a good choice as far as another piece of gear that you're going to use, hopefully for years out there. So if this was helpful, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys next time.